Hello, can you hear me? Oh, perfect. So, actually, before I'm going to start my talk, I want to give you a really quick introduction to myself. I initially studied maths in Cambridge, and then worked as a management consultant for Booz Allen Hamilton in the Middle East and in Germany. After that, I came back to the UK, did an MBA at London Business School, and then worked as head of data science for Tesco. After that, I joined Not on the High Street as their data director, and I joined the BBC about 2 years ago, more or less. And kind of what my talk to you is about today is all of the stuff that I've learned throughout that journey. Because generally, when I come into an organization, my role is really, even though it's a data role, it's quite heavily a product role. And I'm trying to figure out how do you take the capabilities in an organization and help them kind of get the most amount of value out of their data resources. And generally, that means that when I come into an organization, it's all about trying to figure out how to get started on that data journey. So what kind of people do you need to recruit, et cetera. And what I've noticed throughout that time is usually what the expectations are from the marketing teams, the technology teams, the finance teams, et cetera. They're quite heavily, let's call them, well, they're quite heavily influenced, let's put it that way, by really shiny marketing material, right? Like the marketing material that promises you that AI can literally solve all of your problems, and all you have to do is just hire, well, generally just pay someone else, and that's it. And so my approach of this has changed quite a lot since I started this at Tesco. I used to start more from a consulting and prototyping perspective, and now my approach is much more full-stack development. And today I'm here to share with you that third iteration, the latest iteration of how I try and bring organizations on a data journey. And this is still work in progress, so there's probably still a whole bunch of issues that I haven't yet discovered. And the latest iteration is to use what we call a focus product in order to drive both the kind of what you're going to do, but also kind of to force the organization and, in that sense, to build a stronger capability about it, around that area. And so today, I'm going to share with you the initial problem statement that we were working on, how we started, and then how we then used prototypes to better define that area of what we were going to work on, and how we finally ended up setting up a full-stack team in order to create a platform and an app to drive a completely different and new customer proposition. Now, given my background, you might be a bit surprised that I'm not going to talk to you a lot about data. I'm not going to talk to you a lot about KPIs or anything like that. And that's not because I don't believe in data-based product management or data-driven product management or anything like that. It's much more of a reflection of where we were in the product lifecycle and what it really takes to kickstart that kind of transformation within an organization like the BBC. Usually, in the BBC, we use a product or a metrics framework that we call RUBEX. It stands for reach, so how many people are using the product. Usage, so how involved is their use, so how much are they using it. The next one is breadth, so how many different products do they actually interact with, and then kind of what does the quality of the experience look like. But a lot of what I'm talking to you about today happened before BBC Plus was actually launched, and in that sense, actually all of these metrics make a lot less sense. So my role in the BBC is around realizing the potential of data and machine learning for the organization. And as an organization that's been around for about 100 years, we have about 20,000 employees. You can imagine that that kind of as a scope can become really, really broad very, very quickly. And actually what I want to do first a bit as well is just tell you a bit about the BBC's history, because that gives you a little bit of context. So we started in 1922 as a radio company. In the 30s, we added TV to our portfolio. We then did televised news, weather in the Olympics in the 40s. Color TV came in the 60s. In 1974, we launched CFAX, so sometimes called teletext in other countries. In 1982, we launched the BBC Micro. Actually, maybe some people here started their programming journey on the BBC Micro. And then we started moving towards digital radio in 95. And in 1997, we launched BBC News Online. That was a year before Google was founded. And since about 2007, iPlayer, which is our video-on-demand service, has been running. So we've been really a technology company for almost 100 years. But as you can imagine, with kind of any organization of both the age that we have and the size that we have, that also means that we have an insane amount of data silos. Again, like many organizations, these silos have both cultural as well as technological reasons. So when I was interviewing, I asked the chief architect what kind of technology we were using. He said everything, and I came and I thought that was a bit of a joke. But when I started, I realized actually we were using everything. And until about 3 years ago as well, we also had 3 completely separate technology organizations. We had one technology organization that was looking after, the legacy world, so our linear radio and TV. We had one organization that looked after the commercial world, called BBC Studios today. And we had one organization which was looking after what was called future media, which was kind of iPlayer, News Online, etc. But despite all of this, actually, we are quite a successful organization. So we reach 92% of the UK adult population every week. We're the 3rd most popular online service in the UK after Google and Facebook. Globally, 140 million people choose our online services every week. And if we actually take into account our linear channels as well, then we reach about 350 million people worldwide every week, which is more than Twitter. But we still have a problem. All of these silos that I was talking about means that we're shipping our org structure every day. So we're really asking our audiences to do all of the hard work and find the content that's really relevant for them, rather than bringing to them the best of the British, bold, and creative content directly to them. Now, I mentioned that this problem has been around for a while. It's been around more or less since we started with TV, probably in the 30s. So how do you get started on something like that? How do you get started on trying to bring this massive organization of 20,000 people along on the journey? Now, luckily, before I joined, there was already a bit of work that had happened in that direction. So the chief architect had noticed that this was a big issue, and he created something called the Connected Data Program. And the idea of the Connected Data Program was to try and figure out, OK, can we divide our data into 3 areas or kind of key areas? And we were then going to focus on the area of content data. That was mostly because audience data already had quite a big program behind it. And so when I joined, my job was to try and take that narrative a bit further. And what we started working on pretty quickly is that we believed that we needed a central idea, the central thing that we call the content graph. And the content graph was going to basically provide a single view of all the content, all of the interactions with that content, and the relationships between that content to all the products that you would have out there. And what we would be able to do with that way is we would be able to give you a much more consistent user experience as you interacted across the BBC estate. Now, we use the word content graph as much because we thought it was a great marketing name, because your technology execs will have heard of the Google's knowledge graph or Facebook social graph, so it was quite useful that way. But it was also very much of a concept. It wasn't necessarily that we were going to build all of this stuff on top of a graph database. And I came in, I think I started on a Wednesday, and on the Friday in my first week, we ran a workshop to try and figure out, OK, how are we going to move this idea further? How are we going to decide what to do? And if I'm really honest, that was quite scary. So this was day 3 for me. I didn't feel like I had a proper amount of data or understanding of the business problem, and I was being asked by the organization to make some quite wide-ranging decisions in terms of where we were going to go with our work and effort. And the reason why this was the case was because the business was really, really keen to keep that momentum going. We've been talking about it a bit, so we now needed to kind of move into a bit more of the detail stuff. And it felt a bit like journeying into the kind of the center of the TARDIS, right? It felt a bit like going into this thing where you feel, OK, the problem looks probably big from the outside, and you're going in and it's, wow, it's like massive. And in addition, you're being asked to fly this really complicated beast of machinery where you have actually no clue what happens if you push any of the buttons. But luckily, just like the doctor, I had 2 program managers on my side who, while not really understanding data very well, they really understood how the BBC worked, and that was really, really helpful. And so what we ended up doing is we decided that we were going to initially build 3 prototypes. The first one was going to be an audience-facing product that provided like a personalized experience across the different BBC brands, as well as our different content types. So we have audio, video, text. We also have games. We have a whole bunch of stuff. The second one was going to be a tool that actually helps the internal teams to schedule across multiple channels, because as you probably know, we don't just have one BBC TV channel. We have BBC 2 as well, BBC 3, BBC 4. We also do stuff on social media, on the website, et cetera. So it's actually quite a complicated problem for them if they try and do something like a cultural event across all of these different channels, taking into account all the other stuff that needs to happen at the same time. And finally, all of this depends on having a good understanding of data. And for us, metadata is basically the word that we use, even though it's technically not quite correct, but that's what we use for the description of our content. And so the third thing that we were building was a tool that helped to add metadata to content so that it was actually easier to find all of that amazing content that was being produced by the BBC. And at that point, there were 4 of us. There was me, the 2 program managers, and 1 technical person. an architect in our team as well. So what we ended up having to do is instead of us building this by ourselves, we had to bring in a bit of external help and then almost act like product managers while some external people were helping us build some of these prototypes and take them to kind of different levels of kind of sophistication or finish, if you want, functionality. Now, prototypes usually are something that you then kind of learn something from. You have reusable code, ideally. You have some really amazing insights into your audiences as well. Kind of our approach to those prototypes was slightly different. For us, it was a lot more about being able to have something that we could show our key internal stakeholders. So it was something where we could say, look, this was the idea we had around Content Graph, and now these are some of the things that you can do with them. And so even today, we sometimes still bring them out and to illustrate and reinforce kind of some of the key messages that we have. And you might say, wow, that's like a really expensive way to do stakeholder management. Right, I agree, we spent a bunch of money to create some stuff that we showed around a bit internally. But actually, you can't underestimate how important it is to have something tangible when you talk about some very conceptual ideas, right? Data is something that you guys might be breathing and living, but it's not the way that the senior execs in your organization think. They think much more around kind of whatever physical products that's being produced generally. And especially in organizations like the BBC or kind of Tesco or any of those places, product means something that's touchable. It doesn't mean something like that's made out of code, etc. And the other thing that's really important to know about the BBC is really a storytelling organization. For us, the smallest unit is the story. And so it was really, really important to have this narrative that we could move forward just to get a bit of momentum going. And so the 3 prototypes that we had, they gave us the props that we really needed to talk to our Deputy Director General as well as our CTPO, so our Chief Technology and Product Officer, and agree with them what we were going to do going forward. And what we agreed to do going forward was that we were going to focus on building one of those products out. We were going to try and create something that was going to be an audience-facing focused product. And at that point, we started looking for product managers, and actually we found someone from inside of the BBC who had previously been building things like BBC News and BBC Weather apps. And we also started looking for a product manager actually for the platform, but it's surprisingly hard to find data product managers. So it's a good job to be in case that's who you are. And the idea was that actually we were going to have this focus product that was going to allow us to help validate some core capability for the platform and also drive the prioritization for the platform. So in that way, we were going to be able to build a platform, but it wouldn't just suddenly end up as this siloed thing without any route to the audiences or as this thing that was kind of quite just trying to solve all of the problems at once. But now, that basically meant that we had this different challenge. It meant that we had this product that had to drive some audience-facing benefit, and we had this platform. So how do you trade off the user needs of the product and the user, or kind of the needs of the platform that you're trying to build in order to show the product, but also in order to show the platform by itself? And the BBC is an organization that's been around for a while, and we have a lot of really successful digital products. We have quite a few products that have multi-million users. So how do you make sure that you don't build this new product in such a way as stepping onto those toes of those big products? Because then, if the idea is to bring them on board in the longer term, you're just basically going to be upsetting them, and that's bad stakeholder management. And so what we agreed to do as a combined team was that because yeah. So what we decided to agree as a team combined between the app and the platform was we tried to figure out, is there 4 hypotheses that we all believe in that we need to validate? And those hypotheses were that actually people are interested in consuming content from multiple BBC brands in one place. They want a fully personalized experience from the BBC. We can all do all of this technically, and we can all do all of this using new technology, new team, and new ways of working. And I'm just going to kind of take a bit of a discretion around why would you do all of this at the same time? So generally, the BBC is an AWS shop. So a lot of our stuff that we built that isn't on-prem is based on Amazon's web services. Most of our technology is built on Google Cloud Platform. And there's an interesting question and interesting discussions that we had a lot internally around, like, why the heck would you do that? I mean, if you're already building something new, why do you add that much complexity? And it's interesting, as you kind of grow as an organization, at some point, certain organizations get to the point where they say, actually, you know what, we don't want to be just dependent on one cloud provider anymore. And that happened more or less at the same time as we were starting to build. And that happened, the contract was signed with GCP around that same time, and we didn't have any legacy systems. So in a way, it made it good, or we were a prime team that could experiment what GCP building would look like and what kind of the interoperability of the cloud, et cetera, how you would solve some of these problems. But that meant that kind of, even though we were starting from scratch, there was still a certain amount of legacy that we had to deal with, and certain kind of, we couldn't completely pick up something from new, but it was pretty much like starting a new Earth. And so we got bigger, we informed more stakeholders about our work, and what that created was that actually, a lot of the time, then these senior stakeholders would just add some of their problems on top of ours. So he was like, oh, you know, if you're already building this, you should go international first, or it should be all about responsible machine learning, or it should be kind of make sure that from day one, it is really explainable how your machine learning works. And so one of the big challenges that we had early on was to try and stop becoming the solution to everybody's problems. You know, and GCP was one of those examples where we had to do it, but other places we were quite good in shutting some of that stuff off. And so we started recruiting an app team. We started continuing to develop the proposition further. And one of the things that we were quite lucky with in the BBC is actually we have a lot of customer insights or user insights, audience insights already. So what we decided to do is that actually we were going to build an app that was going to target 16 to 34-year-olds, because those are the people that currently don't have the same relationships with us as a brand as their parents do. So it's really important for us to try and find ways to engage those, that customer segment much more than we do today. We knew that those people are really interested in kind of video, and they spend a lot of their time on the phone, so actually we were going to build a native app rather than some sort of website. Because our target population is very mobile focused. It was going to be initially focusing on short-form video. There's a few reasons for that. Short-form video is actually really interesting to that kind of segment. It's also much easier to write recommendation engines for short-form video than for long-form video, because all I'm asking you is to give me 5 minutes of your time rather than 45 minutes of your time. And it's easier internally, technically, for us to play short-form video than it is for us to render articles. That's kind of a historical fact, because the BBC has a standard media player, but there's no standard way of rendering articles because lots of different teams have built different CMSs. And so actually trying to figure out how you bring all of the different articles from different places would have been technically much more challenging. And finally, the app itself was going to would be aimed at helping users make best use out of their spare moments. Spare moments better spent was kind of the key sentence that we tried to use for that. Because actually news updates, again, become slightly challenging in a recommendation world, and plus we have quite a strong news app offering already. This is a space where we had a strong feeling that actually the BBC's, or the perception of the audience with the BBC is significantly weaker. So we knew these would be consistent with the audience's needs from all of the research that had happened in audience platform, in our audience marketing and audience teams. But at this point, we didn't yet know how we were going to convince people to actually download the app. We didn't know what was going to be that trigger or that hook that would get people to download this and open it every day. And generally, you know, as a good product manager, this is just the point where you say, stop, okay, I'm going to stop building this. I need to figure this problem out first. But actually, we were trying to build something to build a platform, right? So we were trying to build this focused product that would push us to build some sort of platform capability. And so we continued to start building the platform in parallel of trying to answer some of those questions and designing some of the Ooh, okay. My click is not working that well. Apologies for that. And designing some of the stuff. So we ended up building the platform and developed some of the UX prototypes in order to try and answer some of those key questions. And so in February 2018, we then went back to what is in the BBC called the Product Direction Steering Group. It's the place that kind of makes decisions around where we allocate most of our product teams, what we focus on, et cetera. And we summed up the problem that we were going to solve as kind of two parts. So we agreed that the goals of the app were going to be, we were going to build the capability to link and surface the breadth of the BBC content to power personalized experiences, and we were going to build an app that could actually showcase this in an audience-facing way. So the app was going to bring together the best of the BBC content together with our editorial values and all of the knowledge that we have around audience interests. And algorithms would be really at the heart of this to then kind of release the power of the three, of the editorial, content, and interests. And at that time, we had built a team of 3 engineers, 3 data scientists, and 2 app developers, I think, and 2 user experience users in addition to the original team. And it was time to start building both of the platform and the app in parallel. Now, in a way, we're quite lucky because we decided that we're going to take quite a thin slice across this. So we were going to build the minimum that was going to satisfy all of this stuff. And that was going to define the roadmap for the platform. But working for an organization like the BBC, you don't have to build completely everything from scratch. So there's already a whole bunch of services that we were able to reuse. So we have a central customer database that stores the interactions that you have with content. We also have the standard media player that I mentioned earlier, which allows us to quite easily render audio and video. And finally, there's a standard methodology that we use for signing people in and out. But even though these standard services exist, a lot of the time the way that we wanted to use them was kind of pushing them quite a bit beyond what was already in existence. So we had to find ways to push the teams that were developing them to just slightly change some of the capability that was in there. But luckily, we knew this was a business change program, so we were putting quite a lot of effort into bringing people on board. And so already from the beginning, we actually worked on getting senior buy-in quite early on. And that meant that when we were building our team, also we had quite a lot of internal people joining us rather than recruiting everything externally. And that meant those internal people knew exactly how those systems worked. And it was quite beneficial for them as well, because it was for the first time that they actually experienced their platform as a user rather than as a developer. And so by the end of July, we had then built a first version of the app. And what that allowed you to do is it allowed you to log in with your BBC account. It allowed you to navigate nicely through the app. So you could receive personalized short-form recommendations. So if you would log in, it would kind of take your history. It would build something that you might be interested in on top of that. You could play those videos in large screen as well. Underneath it, you would get related content. You could see whatever history you had consumed in the past. There were even like one error message, but error messages are important. So it would tell you that you were offline whenever anything went wrong. And you had the ability to log out as well. And really, from a product perspective, that was kind of pretty much what we wanted to do. But as a data and machine learning product, Viable meant something quite different. And it meant having quite different functionality in addition to just having all of that stuff out. And so I just want to quickly talk about some of the challenges around building recommendation engines. And generally, for those of you, right, like you are all, a lot of you are people in this space, there's two classical ways of building recommendation engines. So one is you have some information around content, some sort of descriptions, maybe genres, etc., and that allows you to do something. The challenge for us in this space is that actually, as mentioned before, and our metadata is quite bad. And we're quite inconsistent as well in terms of how we tag stuff. So when we talk about Manchester, for example, for the sports page, that would be definitely one of the football clubs in Manchester. For the news page, that would be the city of Manchester. So even though it's the same tag, it's the same description, it doesn't necessarily mean the same. And the second way of that you would usually build recommendation engines is user-based. But because we have never had some sort of product that actually built some sort of short-form video experience, there was nothing that allowed us to create that history. And the other challenge we have a bit as well is that the existing products within the BBC that surface some of that, some of those short-form videos, they're quite inconsistent in terms of what kind of data they record and how they record that data back in the source systems. And so instead what we decided to do is that actually metadata is something that we can probably start with. That's probably a place where our data is a little bit better. So we started with, okay. Sorry. So we'll start with this. We'll start with the simplest possible model based on metadata. That then provides us with something that we can show to users. The users can then interact with those recommendations, and then that gives us something that we can then build something later on based on content-based or user-based interactions. But obviously, kind of how do you know whether something is good? So we still have to figure out the question around, now that we have a recommendation engine, is this good enough? And you can do all of the typical stuff. So we're not live at this point yet. Remember, we don't have actual audiences. So again, there's a classical way that you build an offline scoring model. And so what we end up doing is we said, OK, we're going to take user interactions with some content data that we already have. We're going to split that into half. We're going to use the first part in order to train the recommendation engine. We're going to look at the second part, see whether the recommendations we predicted, whether they would have clicked on any of that stuff. And that gives us something like a hit rate. And that's, again, that's pretty box standard. You can then also compare that stuff to something like if you had done random recommendations or most recent or most popular, and that gives you some sort of a kind of baseline to see, OK, at least you're not doing something that's really, really bad. it still leaves you with that problem that actually it tells you that you're better than random, or it tells you that you're better than recent. It doesn't quite tell you whether it's good enough as a recommendation overall. And especially with the BBC being quite a strong editorial organization, good enough has very strong opinions that don't necessarily translate very easily into a metric that you can then measure. Okay, so yeah, offline scoring was the solution to that. So what we ended up doing at that point then was, instead of really going for a big launch that was audience-facing, instead we were going to give it the product to lots of people internally. On one hand, that was going to get us more eyes on the app, so we would hear whether there was something that was kind of just not working quite well. And also, it would allow us to basically show what we've been paid for, right? Like, it would allow us to go back to our sponsors and say, look, this is what we've been working on, and here's something that you can play with. This is what basically your money's been paying for. And it also it also allowed us to re-agree basically the direction with our Chief Technology and Product Officer. And from then on, it was all about what we call closing time. By that time, there were about 30 people across all of the team. We had added more data scientists, more data engineers, more app developers, more UX researchers, more UX designers, and all of that stuff. And the focus during that period was really less about adding more features, but it was more around kind of making sure that this app would actually scale and that the platform was really, really strong. So it was around kind of getting that proper scaling in there, making sure we had the proper logging in there that we would understand if something would go wrong, making sure that we had enough videos, so working with the editorial teams to make sure that there was enough tagging, et cetera, in those videos, making sure the recommendations were good enough, that the experimentation platform was there so that when we were going to have live users, we can A/B test something. It was really about this closing time. And we did add some more features, actually, but what was kind of key about those features that we added was that a lot of them were really just extensions of existing capabilities. So we added the ability to navigate through content topics. We added the ability to do search and to like and dislike content as well. But all of that stuff was because our main database we were using was Elasticsearch, so actually adding a search endpoint was really, really easy. And during that time, we were getting some internal feedback. People were telling us what they liked, what they didn't like. The challenge we still had, though, was that it was not necessarily kind of new stuff, and it was also still BBC employees, right? So it was not necessarily the kind of audience that we would bring this in front of, that we were going to put this in front of. And so what the point for us was to get in front of a minimal viable audience as quickly as possible. And that was all of the focus that we had during that time. That being said, that actually one of the things we didn't expect that we ran into was actually putting this in front of lots of journalists and editors, et cetera, brought us to really interesting editorial challenges. And this must be the first time in my career that I've had a discussion during a product meeting around who's going to go to prison if we get any of this stuff wrong. And this is really important about an organization like the BBC, right? So we are both the producers as well as the publishers of our content. That means that we're liable for the content that we create. We're not a platform like Facebook or Google or whatever of those guys who can just say, well, that's not my fault, it's fine. We actually have people that could go to prison if something bad happens. And I just want to give 2 quick examples around what that could look like. So generally, the way that our stuff works is that most of the videos that we create are embedded within an article. And that means that the article itself can kind of balance out some of the stuff that's being said in the video and can also clarify things and it can kind of make points. And so the whole consumption of the BBC is usually an article with an embedded video. If you suddenly have that video by itself, you might not have some of that balance, so we might fall foul either of impartiality, or if we get this really, really wrong, then we fall foul of defamation laws within the UK because we have someone saying something really bad and we don't give the other person space to kind of counteract that a bit. It also creates an issue potentially for us because it's definitely not in line with our editorial guidelines, and our editorial guidelines are definitely one of those things that we hold very, very dearly. The second example that we actually ran into while we were testing this is contempt of court. So say, for example, that someone is currently being accused for sexual harassment, and we have a great video where that person strenuously denies that this is the case. Our content-to-content recommendation engine was pretty good. So what it would do is provide you with lots more content around sexual harassment underneath that. And if this kind of happens while that person is being in court at that point, then that could be considered as us making some sort of statement on the guilt, whether that person is guilty or not. And this is considered, or can be considered, contempt of court, and that actually creates problems and can result in people having to go to prison.
It can be subject.
Well, yeah, it can, and there's, it's one of the big concerns that we have as an organization. And this was the first time that the BBC actually had a fully personalized app. And that meant that actually all of the processes that we usually have in place to stop that kind of stuff, like editors reviewing something, didn't quite focus on those they didn't address the way of automated curation or something like that. But luckily, we have an editor embedded in our team, so that editor was able to work with us and kind of help us navigate through all of these legal complexities and actually make sure that the app that we ended up launching or working on is in line with is in line with our editorial guidelines. Sorry. Yeah, there we go. And with her help, it really made a big difference to make sure that what we put in place massively mitigated that risk. And then in December of last year, finally there was enough happiness within kind of the journalistic community, the editorial community, some of the product people as well, that we were able to launch the app and into the public app stores. So we had our public launch. This is just a really quick video of what it looked like, or not. But at that time, you were able to kind of sign in. It's all beautiful. You can use the typical BBC login. Once you sign in, it then gives you a stream of content that is personalized based on your experience. You can then click on any of the videos. You can watch them. You have lots of recommended content underneath it. Given that it's now live, what I would recommend, just go and download it, have a bit of a play around with it. We definitely haven't solved all of the product issues yet, but it kind of showed one of those ways that you might be able to actually take a personalized experience for the BBC forward. So, as mentioned though, for us it was never really about the app. It was really around trying to create something that is bigger than the app. It was about trying to help the BBC better understand how it could use data or machine learning to drive stuff forward. And for us, this was really around the parting of the ways. So it was around the app becoming its own thing. So the product team for the app is now going away, doing their own stuff, and the platform team doing their own stuff as well. And this is where we are right now. So our big ambition is really for us to try and get more customers, to reinvent how we do machine learning or data-driven product development within the BBC. The team that we have is now responsible for all recommendation engines across the BBC product portfolio. So we're now working on providing recommendation engines for things like sounds and iPlayer and news, etc. Because we've been able to show that actually there's a massive benefit in part of this. But the big thing that we're really working on as well is trying to understand, actually, it was really hard for our teams to build those recommendation engines. It was really hard because none of the basics were in place. So we're also putting quite a lot of effort into building a platform out that we call ML as a platform, which is all there to make it really easy for data scientists to produce new models so that we can put them into tests as quickly as possible. Because we also believe that actually there's always going to be more smart people outside of our team than inside of our team. And so we think that actually some of these platforms will allow them to help us contribute to some of our stuff. Whoa. But this is quite different to the way that the BBC generally works. And that means that there's, a lot of our work is also trying to help the organization come along on this journey, be it through weak code ownership or some of these other things where actually we can work much better closer together. So, kind of what were the key learnings for me? I think, in general, I really, really believe in data-based product management. That being said, in certain places, in certain organizations, when you start off, it's all about creating a story. It's all about creating that narrative, that momentum that allows you to say, look, here's something, it's really exciting. Trust me, give me a little bit of money. I will show you why it's worthwhile and come back to you and keep you engaged. So you have to have it's quite a long storytelling. Most of the big organizations I've worked in, it's taking about a year generally to get started, and then in the second year, you kind of can get into the point where you can actually start scaling up some of the impact that you have on the organization. This is not an excuse, though, to not know what the problem is that you're solving. And so really keeping the customer close to your heart, and that's why we were quite fortunate to have editorial people embedded in our team. We had quite a lot of user experience researchers in the team as well to help us keep us grounded, to keep us honest around. We're not just building something because it's cool maths, it's cool machine learning. We're actually doing something that's somehow hopefully going to make a big difference for the audiences in the longer term. I really believe that actually if you are trying to make a difference and you're trying to change an organization broader than just saying, okay, here's a new cool thing that we can do, focus products can help you do that. There's so much in many organizations that are kind of been around for a while that is kind of broken in big inverted commas when it comes to the way they use data or machine learning. Having something that you can focus on, that can help you prioritize, and that you can also show as kind of an end-to-end process is incredibly valuable. It does actually also allow you to almost have like an agile approach and an agile methodology to building a capability for an organization. I've rushed through quite a lot of stuff really quickly. So if you want to work for us or you want to find out a bit more about the stuff that we're doing within the team, please come and visit our website as well. There's also one more person, Maria, in the back of the room, who can talk to you a bit more about our stuff as well. I'll be here until the end probably of the coffee break as well. So if you're interested in especially data engineers and data scientists, we always have more room for smart people in our team. Thank you.